The Anti-Corruption Evidence Program, the GIACE program, is funded by FCDO and is existent since early 2019, will come to an end in about 6 months' time. The objective of the entirety of the program is and has been to really generate actionable evidence that can help practitioners of various types design and implement more effective anti-corruption programs. In particular, we have focused the program on 3 areas or themes: the international architecture of corruption, with questions about illicit financial flows, anti-money laundering, beneficial ownership, all these issues that are spanning countries and that go international. A second theme, which is on building integrity and ways of us to foster positive ways of creating integrity, so to combat corruption. And a third theme that is focused on sectors and on the subnational dimension of corruption instances. I don't want to go into the themes in more detail. All this is on our website. We're happy to share that and share the link to our website if that was of interest. But in order to generate actionable evidence through the research programs and really help research inform what practitioners can do, we've focused the program on essentially 6 principles. And I'll quickly go through these principles before I turn it over to Claudia and Paul. The first is that we want to start with problems, with true problems that have relevance in the real world, that affect people, that allow researchers to investigate what could be done in order to truly tackle a particular type of problem. The second is that we really want to focus on anti-corruption issues and not litigate definitions of corruption or try to admire the potential, the awesomeness of how we might define particular types of corruption, but then not do anything about it. So it's really a program focused on anti-corruption interventions. The next one is that we want to take politics seriously and really have a deep think about context and not do research that is irrespectively going ahead, not taking into account of what context looks like in the real world and how anti-corruption measures might be adjusted or tweaked in ways to really make progress on anti-corruption. The last one that I'll mention today is the nose-to-tail engagement with practitioners. The idea has been from the get-go that we don't want to just have researchers sit in academic ivory towers in universities across the world and think about corruption, but that there is active engagement and collaboration with researchers throughout the research project, so that those conversations between researchers and practitioners can inform where the research is going. Great, so very glad to kick off this first of 14 sessions. And I'll welcome Claudia Baez Camargo, who is the head of governance at the Basel Institute, as our first speaker. I should say Claudia leads actually 2 projects, so we will be happy to see Claudia come again on screen in a few weeks from now. And also to welcome Paul Haywood, who is the Sir Francis Hill Professor, or having the Sir Francis Hill Chair of Political Science at the University of Nottingham, and who is the Program Director of the GIACE program. With that, I think I'll turn it over to you, Claudia. Take us away.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. Really happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen so you can see my presentation. Can you see it okay? I'm going to maximize. Can you see my screen? My PowerPoint? Yes, great, absolutely. Fantastic. So, so today I will be discussing the findings from this GIACE funded research project, which we call a follow-on project because it builds on findings from a previous project that focused on informality and corruption. So the goal of this follow-on project has been to explore informality, social networks that are articulated in contexts where high informality prevails, and their links to corruptions, as well as the implications for anti-corruption practitioners. So specifically, you might be wondering why study informality at all? And the answer to that is, well, you know, in many of the countries where we work, where the levels of corruption are unfortunately very, very high, actually the laws are pretty good, pretty consistent with international best practices and so on. So the proverbial implementation gap. So the question we wonder about is, okay, if the legal framework is not motivating and structuring and steering how people behave, what is? So this is the reason to look at informal practices, informality, informal norms, and so on. Then, why focus on networks? Well, in these countries where corruption is a problem and is prevalent, we find that it's not really that corruption is the result of a few rotten apples operating in otherwise well-functioning systems, but rather, as our previous research has very clearly shown, we have found corruption to be very much a networked phenomenon. So we're wondering what happens, you know, in terms of being relevant for practitioners. What happens if we shift the anti-corruption focus from individuals, as is normally the case, and adopt a network lens? And this is exactly what we want to find out. And this, I hope I will be able to at least give some answers to these questions as we go forward. So I'll start by giving you some highlights from our research in Tanzania and Uganda. We have compiled 10 case studies of informal networks. I will take you on a little journey today, and I'll give you an overview of our findings. So of these 10 cases, 6 come from Tanzania and 4 from Uganda. And as I take you through the highlights of our findings, there are a few things that I want you to keep in mind, okay? So first of all, one of the things we found out is that in these 2 countries, not only in these 2 countries, there are other countries as well, but particularly for talking about these 2 countries, we have found that exchanging a bribe is not to be seen necessarily as a one-shot monetary transaction. The exchange of a bribe is often used to establish and thereafter to nourish a social connection. So this is the first point I want you to keep in mind. Second, the networks that we're interested in are linking actors from the private sphere and the private sector with actors in the public sector in order to execute an informal transaction. And what do I mean by informal? Here, I simply mean transactions that take place outside what is stipulated in the formal rules and regulations, often, of course, contravening such formal rules and regulations. And finally, these networks that we've mapped are sought and even built instrumentally with concrete purposes. So they are built in order to instrumentally pursue specific goals. So let me start with this last point and talk about what are the goals of these informal networks that we've mapped. So the first one is to access public services. Why? Because often obtaining public services is a cumbersome, time-consuming and frustrating endeavor. And this can apply to things like getting a driver's license, obtaining a land deed, business permits, even connecting to the electrical grill. So this visualization of this network that you see now on your screen it shows an informal network to obtain a driver's license in Uganda in an expedited fashion. So rather than to go through a long sequence of requirements, offices, paperwork, etc., the users on the left inside the little red circle, they need only contact a broker who has the necessary connections with individuals across the different offices responsible for the various stages in the license processing process, who can be given a little something, that is a bribe, to expedite and facilitate the process. The second type of goal for building or joining a network is to obtain business opportunities with the public sector. So this very often has to do with being awarded public contracts, which, as you know, can involve very large sums of money. And these networks are often aimed at derailing competitive procurement processes and committing other types of fraud in order to get the business. So this visualization you're seeing here shows how a group of local government officials, represented by the dark green bubbles, colluded to ensure that they could get various contracts allocated to their own companies, which are represented by the light green bubbles. And to do so, they engineered a network that was lubricated with bribes and kickbacks to ensure the procurement authority would decide accordingly in their favor, and also to neutralize the members of a procurement monitoring body, which you can see in the yellow bubble. The third goal of building a network is to ensure that business runs smoothly. So business people may build bribery networks to secure some competitive advantage over other firms, to avoid sanctions, to obtain permits and licenses swiftly, and so on. So this particular visualization shows the bribery network that was engineered by the owner of a bus operating passenger transport company. So this network involves the irregular exchange of bribes with, for example, the state office responsible for operating the speed radars on the roads, with the police who deploy roadblocks and inspections points, and also with the bus agents who often have real-time information about road conditions and so on. So this allows the passenger buses of this company to get to their destination faster and with less hassle, as opposed to other competitors who might not have such an informal mechanism in place. So in sum, we found that from the perspective of private actors, citizens or business people, there are strong incentives to build or join informal networks. First, because accessing public services is difficult. Red tape, of course, plays a huge role here, but it's only the beginning, because we also found that complex procedures or vague regulations open the door for abusive officials to complicate matters, and therefore create an environment where those who are not wanting to give a bribe might not get what they want. So for example, a process that requires a file to move along a long sequence of officials and offices offers many opportunities where the file might get displaced, might be put at the bottom of the pile, or might even be completely disappearing. For example, opening a business is infamously difficult, cumbersome process in Tanzania. And this visualization that you are looking at here shows the network that a small entrepreneur who was trying to open a flour milling business, he had to construct this network, this bribery network, along 5 different public agencies. And you can see all the people therein who had to be bribed in order to facilitate the opening of this small business. So just a few words on other things that we found out about these networks. First, in terms of the dynamics of the networks, we found that some operate via predominantly extortive dynamics, as is the case of the public official who threatens to disappear a file unless a bribe is given. Other networks are more collusive in nature, where public and private actors conspire together to execute an illicit deal that is mutually beneficial. And of course, some networks have hybrid features, are both, in parts extortive, in parts collusive. Second, as I have mentioned, the networks are organized to achieve certain goals. This means that there is a certain division of labor or that there are some specific roles that different members of the network need to play in order to achieve the goal. So I cannot go into all the details here because of time, but there are 3 critical categories of actors in the networks that I would like to draw your attention to. So first are what we call who we call the seekers. And these are the citizens or business people who want to facilitate their interaction with the state for whatever it is that they may want or need. On the other hand are what we call the doers. And these are the public officials who can make things happen, those who can provide the seekers what they want, the ones who have the stamp in hand that can authorize a permit and so on. And then in many of our cases, very key is also the role of brokers. And these are people who literally live off from developing and cultivating connections with the doers, and by selling this ability to connect with the doers for a living. So this takes me to a point that I would really want to highlight, which is that the networks that we mapped are ultimately about linking up the demand and the supply for informal transactions. And the currency that lubricates these networks is corruption. So what? So this is the proverbial question. This is all very nice and interesting, but what are the implications for anti-corruption practitioners of all of this? So one of the striking findings is that paradoxically, we find that where informality prevails, more controls might breed more corruption. So this network visualization here clearly shows why. This is a network articulated in relation to a competitive land formalization process in Tanzania. The government decided to give unplanned lands to private companies who in turn needed to compete with proposals for what use they would give to the land. And the proposals had to be assessed by the communities involved. So there would be a special committee set up to that effect. The decision of the committee would then need to be reviewed and validated, making sure that everything was done according to process and in a legal way by 2 officials at the municipal level. Thereafter, the decision would need to be further scrutinized and evaluated, and a formal approval be issued by a couple of officers at the ministry level. So what the graphic shows is how a businessman, the white bubble, in collusion with a local government official, the purple one, orchestrated that all of those people involved in the decision-making and oversight process were bribed. And therefore, in the case of, in this case, layering all these control mechanisms and committees actually had the outcome of more corruption occurring than would have probably been the case otherwise. The findings of the research also suggest that anti-corruption practitioners can consider how to tackle corruption both from a demand and a supply side. So on the demand side, focusing on problem solving by tackling things such as, of course, getting rid of unnecessary red tape, streamlining processes, and focusing on improving the ease of doing business could go a long way in removing the incentives that seekers have to engage with these networks. On the supply side, with the corrupt public officials, something that comes out from the research is that it might be a good idea to complement formal controls with other approaches, such as emphasizing monitoring on outputs. So when public contracts are implemented, one can find the footprints of corruption if the material used is not of the right quality and specification, and so on and so forth. Also, coming up with some kind of public service scorecard that can measure and monitor the timeliness and the ease of accessing public services can be a way of tracking whether corruption is still ongoing or not. I know I'm running out of time. I'm almost finished, I promise. In terms, my final slide, in terms of recommendations for practitioners, research in contexts where informality and corruption is prevalent actually suggests that a value-based approach is not necessarily enough. And here I'm thinking, for example, about integrity-based initiatives with the private sector. I've also conducted interviews with some collective action practitioners, and it seems that a purely integrity-based approach is doubly burdensome, especially for small and medium enterprises, in that A, implementing compliance controls is costly, B, if other competitors are not doing the same, the business is being lost. And there is an intertemporal dilemma in that we're asking businesses to forego a clear present mechanism to get business in exchange for a future and for the most part uncertain and unidentified benefit. So focusing on addressing the problems that push businesses to engage in the bribery and in joining the networks might be a good approach. Secondly, there's of course a lot of interest in anti-corruption multi-stakeholder initiatives, and one of the things we've learned from the research is that of course some networks are decisively extortive, and we've heard from several business people that they engage and they participate because they feel they have no choice. And a good example of an initiative that gave a choice to businesses is the Business Ombudsman of Ukraine, which is a dispute resolution mechanism that helps businesses who deal with abusive public officials and mediates and helps develop legal cases to support them. And it has a success rate of over 90%, which is quite incredible. And it gives the businesses the alternative, the non-corrupt alternative they need in order to address their business needs through non-corrupt channels. And finally, of course, some networks are collusive and all the participants are benefiting, and this makes them particularly challenging to tackle. And here I think that there's, there's really a need for better detection mechanisms, need to invest in credible whistleblowing and whistleblower protections. An example of how this can be operationalized is the high-level reporting mechanism, which is a public-privately agreed upon instance where built around particularly sensitive and high-risk procurement processes that allows those involved to safely and effectively report suspicious activities. So I've gone well over time. I'm sorry about that, but I cannot finish before thanking my wonderful, wonderful research team. And I know that from Tanzania, Dr. Danstan Mukono is in the call, so I can tell you directly, thank you so much, Dan, for your great work. Thank you also to our Uganda-based researchers and of course my Basel colleagues. And I'll stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Claudia. That was a really nice presentation, really clear. And thank you also for doing this work on sort of a network-based analysis of how these corrupt exchanges take place, because I think it's an issue which I suppose now that it's starting to be done in some regards, it's surprising that there hasn't been more work in the past on network analysis and networks of corruption and how it works in practice. It's a really fruitful and potentially insightful way of understanding the issues that we face. I'd recommend to everybody who's on this session, if you haven't actually looked at the reports, the links are in the chat. They're really worth reading. They're very, very insightful, deep, informative, and they give a real flavor of exactly how the networks work in these two cases. So, do have a look. I'm gonna open this up to questions in a moment. Do please feel free to put questions in the chat. I see there's one from Sky already there, and do feel free to use the hands up option. And I see there is one question from Carlos already waiting. We haven't got a translation into Spanish, I'm afraid, at the moment, but I'm sure Claudia would be more than happy to respond to any question in Spanish, or take any question in Spanish if you want to ask in Spanish, and we can translate for you. So I'm going to come to the questions that are waiting in just a moment, but I first of all have a couple of questions I want to explore myself that come out of this research. So the first question is really about the makeup of the networks. I think, what you've done, I think, is really interesting and persuasive in terms of distinguishing between different types of networks, between extortive, collusive, hybrid networks, and also really insightful to identify the different roles of people within those networks, identifying seekers as opposed to brokers and facilitators, etc. That makes an awful lot of sense in terms of how these networks operate. But the question is about whether the networks are sort of managed in an organizational sense. So if we think of other kinds of networks that we're more familiar with from research that's been done, so say take corruption in police forces, where there's been a lot of work on how in New South Wales and New York police corruption functioned. Those were clearly very managed networks with kind of leaders and roles within them. Or if you take mafia type organizations as networks, they are clearly very strongly managed. So are the types of networks we're talking about in this more informal setting, are they managed in that same kind of sense? And if they're not, what is the dynamic that keeps them going? If they are, then is there a factor of kind of the quality of leadership or management that contributes to how they work? So your thoughts on that would be great.
Sure, that's a really good question, Paul. And maybe just as a background to my answer, we are at the moment, this is just one of the deliverables for this project. We are at the moment working on another draft that is looking at the body of evidence that we have collected on networks that link to corruption. So we have also looked at, some of my colleagues have mapped out networks linked, for example, with the Odebrecht scandal. We have also mapped networks of illicit wildlife trade, and so on. So we're distilling what are the basic mechanisms that we see happening across all these different types of networks. And there are indeed some basic, I would call them basic network management functions. And we call these the 3 4s. So the four C's. The first C is cooptation, which means that you need to be able to bring into the network the people you need to get the different activities, the different tasks done. So identifying who has to be part of the network and bringing them on board is one of these basic network management functions. The second one is control, which is really about enforcing discipline within the network, which is especially important for informal networks that are operating in this manner, because obviously there's no like a formal way to enforce like in a contract in the formal world. So coming up with mechanisms to enforce discipline and otherwise elicit some kind of control is another key network management function. Third one is camouflage, because these networks operate underneath the legal radar, and therefore there is a need to protect the network from detection. So this is what camouflage is about. And the fourth one is coordination, which is about ensuring that everybody does what they have to do in the time and the moment they need to. So we're already coming up with some lessons as to, for example, the degree to which operating these network management functions is feasible and manageable obviously has to do with the size and complexity of the networks. We do know that networks collapse. It's not that networks are infallible, and they might collapse because they are detected, or some of them may implode just because the expectations are too big to be sustained by what the network can deliver. We also think that there is a trade-off or a correlation where as networks become bigger and more sophisticated, the coordination function becomes more difficult, as does the camouflage. So they become, the more ambitious the network gets in a way, the more vulnerable it becomes to detection. So yes, I think this would be my off the head thoughts on your question.
No, that's great. No, and makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to turn to some of the other questions that we've got. The first, I think, was from Sky in the chat. But Sky, do you want to ask it directly rather than just have me read it out?
Yeah, that works. I'm happy to ask and elaborate a little bit. So you mentioned the kind of finding around adding controls and that being an effect on sort of incentives and giving more reason to sort of engage folks in the network. So I was curious if as you add controls, if you saw any variation in how the controls were actually sort of executed or enforced, if that actually did make a difference or not. And just, yeah, curious if you could elaborate on any of that. Would be great. Thank you.
Sure, this is a great question. And actually, our two case studies offer a very good opportunity to compare, because Tanzania, during the time that the late President Magufuli was in office, it really experienced a change of tune, if you want, in terms of enforcing top-down and anti-corruption drive. And we see that really changes things. However, and whereas in Uganda, the people can still operate more or less confidently with the assumption that impunity is the norm. And this certainly was not the case in Tanzania during the administration of President Magufuli. However, what I can also say is that what we have observed is that unless the basic problems or issues or bottlenecks that are generating the demand for corruption are addressed, it's likely that corruption might morph or might evolve into something different. So I'll give you an example actually from my other GIAs-funded project, where we're developing a pilot intervention to address bribery in Tanzanian health facilities. And there we saw very starkly how, once Magufuli came into power, people, before they were talking very openly about bribery in accessing health services, and it was all over, and people were very confident and open to talk about it. Under Magufuli, the tune changed drastically, and actually we were told that yes, a lot of the bribery disappeared. However, not all of it. And interestingly, the way people articulated or referred about it changed. So we went from a situation where people spoke openly about bribery to one where people were talking more about gift giving, about gratitude, about giving a gift from the heart. And we know, because we did the research, that the intention was ultimately the same. But because there was still this, and in this case, I'm talking about a mismatch between demand and supply in a way, and the fact that people have to endure long, long queues to receive health services, that root problem not being addressed meant that the problem, the bribery used as a solution morphed and changed face, but did not disappear.
Thanks, very helpful.
Great, thanks very much. We have a question from Carlos, so please, over to you. You seem to be still on mute.
We cannot hear you, Carlos.
Carlos, is probably, this seems to happen from time to time with these things. It's probably easiest if you leave and rejoin, and then we'll come straight back to you, because that seems to sometimes sort things out. But at the moment, we're not hearing what you're saying. So let me then pass on to Guillaume. You also have a question. Do you want to ask it directly?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Oh, excellent. Okay, hello. And sorry for the video, the webcam is not working. Yes, I have a question, Claudia. It's always about this project in Tanzania on hair facilities. So you use the social norms approach, and I guess it's to change, as you said, the reference network dynamic, and especially at the cognitive level. But it was something, a question, a very simple one about the brokers and facilitators. How do you address their resistance to change? How do you ensure that they will support change because they have a direct economic interest to keep their key role and make money from their position?
Yes, this is a very good question. And of course, as we all know, addressing corruption always means that those that are profiting will lose out. So I guess the best answer I can give you is that, as in any other, market-driven transaction, because I do think that we can speak about demand and supply here. I think that tackling the demand is hugely important, and if people find that they no longer have a need to resort to the brokers, I mean, they will certainly be unhappy, but they might have to change jobs. I don't know. Of course, once we start talking about higher level networks involving more powerful vested interest, then the discussion definitely changes, and it actually becomes a political question. So this is one of the issues that we want to address in this upcoming paper that I was mentioning, which is how, are there ways in which one can diffuse the networks that give rise to grand corruption that involve the less possible political upheaval. I'm sorry, Guillaume, I don't think I have a very, very good question for you. A very, very good answer for you at the moment. But I do think that the broker's role will lose a lot of relevance if the initial motivations from the demand side are addressed. We have seen this, for example, in Rwanda, where we've also conducted research, and it's an interesting case to contrast because they have similar social norms and the social fabric is similar to that in Tanzania and Uganda. And there, where the state has invested a lot in ensuring that public services are easily accessible, that they are sufficiently funded and financed so that you don't have that huge gap between supply and demand, that people just don't see the need to resort to a broker or a network. I hope this answers somewhat your question.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Now I see Carlos is back. Let's try again. Better luck
work now. Am I?
Yes, indeed.
Oh, good. Hi, Claudia. Thank you very much for that presentation. I think, yes, networks seem natural to understand corruption. I think Paul mentioned the mafia, and obviously, I think you could not do anything in corruption if you didn't have a network. So it's key. So it's very natural. And your descriptions of Uganda, Tanzania, countries I have worked with. I'm with the Legatum Institute now, but I have worked with the European Union and the World Bank before. I think what surprised me is that it wasn't surprising, that everything kind of made sense. I mean, that's how economics work. I mean, businesses need to make business, and they will do whatever is needed. So I mean, it was nice to have it in a model, kind of, the description and being explicit about it. But I didn't see sort of surprises there, even though when applied, as in the case of Peru that you share with us, and we have used in Peru extensively, in the case of Odebrecht, is really illuminating. But my question is in relation to the controls that was mentioned and the kind of the solutions that are looked. I think, to me, it seems that it's not really addressing the right place. I think, to me, it's the politics. It's sort of like the judiciary and the political parties and the setup, the political settlement of a country that allows and forces that kind of generation of rents. So it's a system that works at all levels, obviously for some part of the population, but it works at all levels. So the idea that, just a control system there, a controller, technical solutions are going to fix what is fundamentally a political problem, a political arrangement, of political parties, seems to me the part where anti-corruption efforts for the last 10, 15, 20 years that have been technical have not worked. So, and of course, addressing that, and, we're working on that in Peru, is kind of impossible. But, I just wanted to see your views on this.
Yeah, gracias, Carlos. Of course, I'm a political scientist, but I cannot help but agree with you. And actually, I mean, in this paper that we are still writing at the moment, one of the key typologies of networks are the networks that are articulated in order to compete for and win elections, which of course are, this is what you're talking about when you talk about the political settlement. So these are networks that are really quite crucial in how power is acquired and exercised. And we could speculate, we could discuss. There are cases where, for example, we have the case of Georgia, where through an electoral process, a reformist elite came to power that was able to push through very dramatic anti-corruption reforms. So it's not that dealing with this original political problem is impossible, but we do know that this is more the exception than the norm. So this is one of the things that we're trying to unpack in our upcoming publication. Just to give you a taste of what my thinking on this is about, is that as long as you have, I mean, in many of our countries, we have political elites that are networked with important business interests, and that have been actually, it's not unusual to see the same faces just rotating over and over through time, sometimes even through dynasties. My take is that as long as these kind of networks remain in power, where somehow corruption has been a currency lubricating the political settlement for a long time, it's really difficult for a real thrust for reform to come from within. You require an outsider to be able to somehow come to power. And this was the case in Georgia, for example, through the electoral way. In other countries like Rwanda, this was in the aftermath of a horrible, violent conflict. But you need a leadership that somehow is free from the responsibilities and expectations of belonging to such a network. Yeah, so I think I'm going to stop at that, because otherwise I'm just going to talk for the rest of the hour on this topic. But I hope this gives you a taste of what my thinking is on this topic. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Johannes, you have your hand up at least.
Yeah, so I find this exciting and hugely insightful, Claudia. I wonder, my question is about whether you could give us a little more insight, whether you could explore some of your thinking around the so what. In particular, your first 2 points about, cutting red tape and easing the way of people do business. Because obviously, this is one of the key questions that has pervaded the private and public space for a long time in very different ways and forms, and with people coming at this with very different motivations. And what you are, I think, laying out in your research is, on the one hand, that you have these formal networks, formal sets of institutions that are all meant to help achieve a particular purpose, they serve a particular function. And then you find that there is demand by people, and from their perspective, it is not doing that. It is not achieving that purpose with the right degree of efficiency or sufficiency to get to that purpose. And then, instead of sticking with this formal arrangement, there is this informal network and informal institutions. It's sort of like a paradoxical way of phrasing it, but informal ways of trying to get to the same objective. And from our perspective, and also that from everybody else in society, that poses real problems, because it circumvents some of the safeguards and some of the ideas for which the formal networks were created in the first place. So thinking about this, so what are the ways, or how could we think about either principles or tipping points in which we could explore, cutting red tape or easing the way of doing business in different ways that would help us understand to what extent we can go further into the direction of using the formal institutions and networks and getting rid of those informal society damaging networks, and what would be ways in which that could be explored or tested, including by practitioners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so of course there is no silver bullet to any of this, but I do think that cutting red tape is hugely important. I mean, I know that some people will say, well, yes, but then at some point maybe there will come a need to re-regulate again, and just as the informal networks are able to game the system when it's complex, they will do the same with even more gusto if it's not complex. So those are all points well taken, and any answer requires to be mindful of context. That being said, I personally do think that there is a lot of promise, for example, in e-government and digitalization. There are examples of countries that have gone a long way in automating and digitalizing public processes, mechanisms, payments, and so on. Rwanda being one example, and actually from the example of Tanzania, I just spent a couple of weeks doing research there last month, and it is clear that one of the things that President Magufuli did was to encourage digitalization of payments, and that across the board, what I heard has really helped. The other idea is the kind of one-stop shop model to help, for example, people who want to open a business, and to really streamline and facilitate the process so that it is easier to open a business, and it's also easier to monitor the process by means of which this happens. So this would be two ideas of entry points that I think are particularly promising.
So thanks. Can I follow up a bit around this sort of whole issue of red tape, regulation, etc. And it's really, I guess, to ask whether that dimension of obstacles, I guess. I mean, because you're absolutely right. I mean, what you said in response to Johannes about, deregulation often being seen as an important means of cutting corruption or helping to cut corruption as well as to promote economic growth because of, bureaucratic obstacles. Then you get a move to deregulate, which is nearly always followed by a move to re-regulate, because you have to have some form of regulations to allow markets to function properly and effectively. So you've got almost this dance of deregulation, re-regulation. But and it's also obvious that, in certain settings and the kinds of settings you're describing, bureaucratic obstacles are deliberately put in place in order to create opportunities for corruption. That goes without saying. But let's say we get to a kind of a properly regulated framework where the red tape is the red tape that needs to be there. It's all working efficiently. You're still going to get a situation in which there are, decision points which some people will want to get round. Even if things are functioning absolutely as they should, people will want shortcuts. They'll want to avoid having to fill in the forms, etc. So how do we ensure, even with a reduction of red tape in the negative sense, that once you've got a proper regulatory framework, you're not still going to get both collusive and extortive networks to get round the regulations that have to exist?
Thank you, Paul. Let me respond to this question in this way. I think that there is absolutely no country on earth that is entirely free of corruption. And I don't think it's realistic to have that as a goal. If that is our goal, then we are, already fighting a lost battle. Let's think about ways to improve. Let's think about ways to address, the incentives to join the bribery and the kickbacks and the corruption. Let's talk about ways in which people can get what they want and need without resorting to that. I'm convinced there will always be a way to game the system. There will always be people who will be able to break the rules and get away with all sorts of illicit, illegal feats. But let's be a little bit more humble and start instrumentally and see how we can improve things.
Okay, fair enough. Very, very quickly, David, I'm just going to give you a chance to ask a quick question, please, and a quick response, and then we'll hand back to Johannes to wrap up. So, David. David, I see your hand. I see a nice D. And I'm not hearing anything. So I assume you are having similar technical problems to the ones that Carlos had earlier. Technical problems. Okay, in that case, let me hand over to Johannes. Let's say thank you very much to Claudia for responding to those questions, and thank you for all the questions, some really insightful ones there and great responses as well. So Johannes, over to you.
Great, thank you, David. Do signal if you've resolved your technical problem. But yes, echoing Paul, thank you so much, Claudia, and also Paul for moderating this discussion. Thank you for everyone joining us today. This is great. This is really useful, and we hope to have another 13 sessions of the same sort next week, starting with Laura Nkula from Cape Town University and Gilbert Siame, about how professional communities of planners, of urban planners in South Africa and Zambia can get to places where they live by higher standards of integrity and drive integrity throughout the way that they do the urban planning with their fellow professionals. So that should be a very exciting way of us investigating this question of how we can more constructively build systems of integrity and have people's insights about how to actually flesh out these systems to help us stave off corruption. So that's next week, and I encourage you all to sign up. Maybe we can put the link into the chat, Veronica, if that was possible, to sign up for next week, and then all the following sections. I won't read them all out, but the basic idea is that starting with this week, and then every Thursday at this hour, we'll have one of the GIA's researchers join us, present their findings, and stand ready for questions and answers. So with that, thank you also to Veronica and Ambika for organizing all this. And yeah, with that, I think nothing left to say. We're just on time. Thank you all. Thank you, and Claudia and Paul, and see you all next week.